The year was 1961. The world was balancing on the razor's edge of a nuclear apocalypse. The Cold War had moved beyond the posturing of diplomats and into the silent, terrifying realm of the deep ocean. For over a decade, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in an arms race, but by the turn of the decade, the balance of terror had shifted. The Americans had launched the USS George Washington, the world's first ballistic missile submarine. It was a weapon of unprecedented stealth and power, capable of prowling the oceans unseen and unleashing a nuclear firestorm on Soviet cities from beneath the waves. In the Kremlin, the mood was one of furious desperation. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, pounded his fists on the table and demanded an answer. He felt the American submarines circling his empire like wolves. He ordered his admirals to build a Soviet missile carrier, a machine that could match the American threat missile for megaton, and he gave them a deadline that was impossible. The order was clear: catch up and overtake America. But in the complex, unforgiving world of nuclear engineering, where precision is the difference between life and death, fast usually means deadly. The result of this desperate, politically driven rush was Project 658, known to the West as the Hotel Class, and known to history by its hull number K-19. On paper, the K-19 was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. It was a leviathan of steel, the first Soviet submarine to be powered by nuclear reactors and armed with nuclear ballistic missiles. It was designed to be the pride of the fleet, a symbol of communist technological superiority that would carry the threat of the apocalypse to the shores of New York and Washington, D.C. But the reality of the K-19 was far darker. It was a machine built on cut corners, skipped safety checks, and ruthless political pressure. To meet the impossible deadlines set by Moscow, the shipyard workers in Severodvinsk were forced to work in conditions that resembled a gulag. They worked 24-hour shifts in the freezing Arctic winter, welding steel plates in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. Electricians wired complex circuits while hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Engineers were told to ignore safety protocols in favor of speed. The K-19 was not being built. It was being thrown together by a system that valued deadlines more than human lives. From the very moment the keel was laid, the submarine seemed to be cursed. The sailors, superstitious by nature, whispered that the boat was born bad. It was hungry for blood. During the construction phase, a series of disasters plagued the project that would have halted any Western shipyard. 2 separate fires broke out in the cramped compartments, killing workers and scorching the hull. 6 women tasked with gluing rubber lining to a water tank in a confined space died from toxic fumes because no one had provided them with proper ventilation. A massive missile hatch cover fell during installation, crushing an engineer to death. It was as if the machine itself was demanding a sacrifice before it even touched the water. But the most chilling omen, the one that every sailor would remember for the rest of their lives, occurred on the day of the christening. In naval tradition, the christening of a ship is a sacred moment. A bottle of champagne is smashed against the bow to bless the vessel and her crew. By tradition, a woman does the honors. But in the Soviet Union, tradition was secondary to efficiency. A man, a high-ranking officer, was chosen for the task. As the Soviet dignitaries, the shipyard workers, and the crew stood on the freezing dock, the officer swung the champagne bottle against the rubber-coated steel of the K-19's bow with all his might. It bounced. The bottle didn't break. It slid off the hull intact and rolled across the dock. A collective gasp went through the crowd. In the superstition of the sea, an unbroken bottle is the ultimate bad omen. It means the ship is cursed. It means she will never bring her crew home safely. The sailors looked at each other in silence, their faces pale. They knew this was not just a submarine. It was a coffin. They began to call it Hiroshima, Later, the widows of the crew would give it a more enduring name, the Widowmaker. Despite the omens, despite the incomplete tests, despite the fact that the reactor officers hadn't finished their training, the K-19 was commissioned. Its captain was Nikolai Zateyev, a brilliant, ambitious, and demanding officer. Zateyev was a true believer in the Soviet system, but he was also a realist. He saw the flaws. He knew the reactors were temperamental. He knew the backup systems had not been installed properly. He famously wrote letters to the High Command pleading for more time to test the boat, warning the admirals that the K-19 was not ready for combat. He told them that sending this ship to sea was suicide. His warnings were ignored. The party demanded a patrol. The pressure was absolute. Zateyev was told to sail or be replaced. On its maiden voyage, the K-19 was ordered to sail into the North Atlantic to conduct a missile drill simulating a nuclear strike on the United States. They were to prove to the Americans that the Soviet bear had teeth. On July 4, 1961, ironically, American Independence Day, the K-19 was prowling deep underwater off the coast of Greenland. The mission against all odds was proceeding well. They had conducted the tests. They had fired a practice missile. The crew was beginning to relax. Perhaps the curse was just a superstition. Perhaps the Soviet engineers had pulled off a miracle and the boat would hold together. But physics does not care about luck, and radiation does not care about politics. At 04:15 in the morning, deep in the reactor compartment, a catastrophe began on a microscopic level. A tiny pipe in the primary cooling loop of the starboard nuclear reactor cracked. It was a microscopic failure likely caused by a bad weld done by an exhausted worker months ago, or perhaps a drop of solder left inside the pipe during the rushed construction. But under the immense pressure of the reactor, that microscopic crack became a geyser. The pressure in the cooling system plummeted to zero. The coolant, the pressurized water that keeps the uranium core from melting, flashed into steam and drained away. The massive cooling pumps screamed as they sucked on empty air. The silence of the deep ocean was shattered by the wail of the radiation alarms. In the control room, the scene turned into a nightmare. Captain Zateyev stared at the dials in horror. The temperature in the reactor core was rising uncontrollably. 300 degrees, 400 degrees, 500 degrees. Without coolant, the uranium fuel rods were beginning to heat up towards a meltdown. Zateyev realized with a cold dread that the situation was far worse than a simple mechanical failure. If the core melted, the uranium fuel would slump to the bottom of the reactor vessel. It would trigger a runaway chain reaction. The K-19 was carrying 3 nuclear missiles and 2 nuclear reactors. A thermal explosion would not only destroy the submarine instantly, it would scatter massive amounts of radioactive fallout across the North Atlantic. But the implications were even more terrifying. The K-19 was operating near a NATO base on John Mayen Island. A nuclear explosion in the middle of the ocean during the height of the Cold War would not look like an accident. It would look like a Soviet nuclear first strike that had gone wrong, or perhaps a NATO attack on a Soviet ship. The Americans would detect the blast. Their satellites would see the flash. Their seismographs would feel the shock. In the tense atmosphere of 1961, the United States might retaliate. Captain Zateyev realized that he wasn't just fighting to save his ship. He was fighting to prevent World War III. He ordered the reactor scrammed. The control rods dropped to stop the reaction. The rods slammed home, but the heat was already too intense. The decay heat from the fission products continued to generate massive amounts of thermal energy. The fuel rods were warping. The temperature kept climbing. They needed to cool the reactor now. Zateyev turned to his engineering officer looking for the standard procedure. "Engage the backup cooling system," he ordered. The officer looked at him, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Captain, There is no backup cooling system. This was the fatal flaw. The rush to launch, the corners cut. In their haste to beat the Americans, the Soviet designers had not installed a separate emergency water loop for the reactor. American submarines had redundant systems for exactly this scenario. The K-19 did not. The pride of the Soviet Navy had no way to cool its own engine if the main pipe broke. It was a design negligence of criminal proportions. The engineers back in Moscow had signed the death warrants of the crew to meet a production quota. The K-19 was now a ticking time bomb. The temperature in the reactor room was approaching 800 degrees Celsius. The radiation levels were rising so fast that the needles on the ship's Geiger counters were bending against the stops. The ship was filling with invisible death. The paint on the reactor vessel was beginning to bubble and smoke. Zateyev had only one option left, a desperate suicidal option that was not in any manual. They had to build a new cooling system, from scratch. While the reactor was melting down, they had to cut into the ship's fresh water supply, run a pipe into the reactor room, weld it to the cooling loop, and pump water manually over the melting core. But to do this, men would have to go inside the reactor compartment. They would have to walk into a room that was glowing with lethal levels of gamma radiation. They would have to work inches away from the exposed core. It was a suicide mission. Anyone who entered that room would be dead in days, maybe hours. And here was the final insult of the Soviet system: the crew had no protection. There were no lead-lined radiation suits, no heavy aprons. The Soviet Navy had provided them with nothing but thin chemical protection suits, essentially rubber raincoats and gas masks, designed to stop mustard gas, not gamma rays. It was like trying to stop a bullet with a piece of paper. Captain Zateyev looked at his crew. He looked at the young boys, 19 and 20 years old conscripts from villages who had barely seen the world. He had to order them to their deaths. He assembled the engineering team. He didn't lie to them. He didn't give them a political speech about the glory of the motherland. He told them the cold, hard truth. If we don't go in there, the ship explodes. We all die. And we might start a war. The reactor must be cooled. Who will go? The lieutenant in charge of the reactor, Boris Korchilov, stepped forward. He was 20 years old. He was handsome, popular, and had a fiancée waiting for him back home. He knew exactly what the radiation would do to him. He knew he would never see his wedding day. He looked at the captain, his eyes clear and steady, and nodded. "We will do it." 2 other sailors stepped up with him, then 3 more. They formed teams of 3 to work in shifts of 10 minutes. 10 minutes was a death sentence, but it was the only way. The curse of the unbroken champagne bottle had finally come to collect its due. The K-19 was no longer a warship. It was a sacrificial altar. And the sacrifice it demanded was the blood and the future of its own crew. As Korchilov and his team picked up their welding torches and walked toward the heavy steel door of the reactor compartment, the air around them seemed to vibrate with the invisible energy of the meltdown. They were not just sailors anymore. They were martyrs. The heavy door hissed open, releasing a blast of blue ionized air that smelled of ozone and death. They stepped inside into the blinding light of the radiation, and the door clanged shut behind them, sealing their fate. Inside the reactor compartment of the K-19, the environment was no longer compatible with human life. It had become a different planet. The air was not just hot, it was electrified. The radiation levels were so extreme, thousands of Röntgens per hour, that the air itself was ionizing, glowing, with a faint, ghostly blue-purple light. This was the Cherenkov effect, manifesting in the atmosphere of the room, a visual signal that invisible bullets of energy were tearing through space and matter. For Lieutenant Boris Korchilov and his team of welders, walking into that blue fog was like walking into the core of a star. They wore no lead suits. They wore no respirators. They were dressed in chemical spill gear that offered as much protection against gamma rays as a sheet of newspaper offers against a machine gun. As they knelt on the steel grating inches from the glowing reactor lid, they could feel the radiation tasting like metal in their mouths. They could feel their skin prickling, a sensation described as thousands of tiny ants biting them at once. It was their cells dying in real time. The task was physically simple, but practically impossible. They had to cut into the intricate piping of the ventilation system, which contained fresh water, and weld a new pipe to connect it to the cooling loop of the reactor. Then, they had to install a pump to force the water through. Under normal conditions in a shipyard, this was a 2-hour job for a master welder. In the hell of the reactor room in the dark, choking on ozone surrounded by steam and lethal energy, they had 10 minutes. Any longer, and they wouldn't just die. They would lose consciousness before they could finish the job. Korchalov worked with a desperate manic focus. He watched the blue sparks of his welding torch mix with the blue glow of the radiation. He knew that every second he spent there was peeling years off his life. But he also knew that just on the other side of the bulkhead, hundreds of his friends were waiting, praying that he wouldn't fail. If he stopped, the ship died. If the ship died, the missiles might cook off. If the missiles cooked off, the Americans might launch. He was welding to save the world. After 10 minutes, the door opened. Korchalov and his team stumbled out. They were not the same men who had walked in. The transformation was immediate and horrifying. In just 600 seconds, the acute radiation syndrome had already begun to ravage their bodies. Their faces were flushed, red, swollen, as if they had been beaten. They were vomiting uncontrollably, their bodies trying to purge a poison that was already rewriting their DNA. They couldn't stand. Their shipmates dragged them to the decontamination area, stripping off their radioactive clothes, scrubbing their skin until it bled, but it was useless. The radiation wasn't on them. It was in them. But the job wasn't done. The pipe wasn't finished. The second team had to go in. 3 more sailors, looking at the wretched condition of the first team, picked up the tools and stepped into the blue light. Then the third team. It was a conveyor belt of martyrdom. 9 men in total entered the reactor compartment that day. They worked in shifts of death. They finished the weld. They installed the pump. And finally, miraculously, the water began to flow. Inside the control room, Captain Zateyev watched the temperature gauges. They stopped rising. Then slowly, agonizingly, they began to fall. The reactor was cooling. The meltdown was averted. The explosion that could have started World War III had been stopped by the hands of 9 young men. But the K-19 was not safe. It was a floating tomb. In the chaos of the repair, a fatal mistake had been made, another design flaw, in a ship built of flaws. When the reactor compartment door was opened to let the welders in and out, the pressure differential sucked radioactive aerosols and radioactive steam out of the reactor room and into the ship's ventilation system. The K-19 recycled its air throughout the entire submarine. Within minutes, the radioactive gas was pumped into every compartment. The control room, the torpedo room, the mess hall, the sleeping quarters, nowhere was safe. The radiation alarms, which had been screaming in the reactor section, now began to scream everywhere. The entire crew was being irradiated. Panic began to set in. The sailors realized they were trapped in a steel tube that was slowly killing them. They were thousands of miles from home in the middle of the North Atlantic. Their radio was weak, the long-range antenna damaged. They were alone. And then a new threat appeared. The sonar operator called out a contact. An American destroyer. The USS Campbell was shadowing them. The Americans had likely detected the distress or the strange maneuvers. They were signaling, offering assistance. "Do you require help?" For Captain Zateyev, this was the ultimate dilemma. His men were dying. The Americans had doctors' food and clean ships. They could save his crew. But this was the height of the Cold War. The K-19 was the Soviet Union's newest, most secret weapon. It was packed with cryptographic machines, code books, and 3 nuclear missiles. If he accepted American help, he would have to surrender the submarine. The Americans would tow it back to the U.S. They would learn every secret of Soviet naval technology. Zateyev knew the orders from Moscow. Do not let the ship fall into enemy hands. If he accepted help, he would be a traitor. His family back home would be disgraced, perhaps imprisoned. Zateyev made his choice. He refused the American help. He ordered the signalman to send no reply. He turned his back on salvation to protect the secrets of a state that had sent him to sea in a broken ship. But he knew his crew was reaching a breaking point. He sensed a mutiny brewing. Some of the officers were whispering. They wanted to surrender. They wanted to live. They had guns. Zateyev, in a move of cold, calculated command, ordered all small arms on the ship, the AK-47s, the pistols, to be collected. He took them to the bridge and threw them overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. He kept only 5 pistols, 1 for himself and 4 for his most loyal officers. He told the crew, "We will wait for our own fleet, or we will sink here together, but we will not surrender." For hours, the K-19 drifted, a radioactive ghost ship rolling in the heavy swell. The crew lay in their bunks, too sick to move. The air tasted of metal. The heat was suffocating. The men who had repaired the reactor, the Chernobyl squad, were in agony. Their skin was turning black. Their eyes were swollen shut. They were conscious, but they were disintegrating. Zateyev stayed in the control room, watching the horizon, waiting for a miracle or for death. He had sent a weak distress signal on a backup transmitter, hoping a Soviet Isle submarine operating nearby might hear it. Finally, a shape appeared on the horizon. It wasn't an American destroyer. It was the S-270, a Soviet diesel submarine. The relief was overwhelming. The S-270 pulled alongside the heaving radioactive bulk of the K-19. But the rescue was a horror show. The sea was rough. Transferring the wounded was dangerous. And when the captain of the S-270 saw the men of the K-19, he recoiled in shock. They didn't look like sailors anymore. They looked like monsters. They were hairless, swollen, covered in burns and sores. They were naked because their clothes were so radioactive they had been stripped off. The transfer began. The most critical cases, Korchilov and the welders, were moved first. They were carried on stretchers wrapped in blankets. As they were lowered into the S-270, the radiation detectors on the rescue sub went wild. These men were so radioactive that they were essentially living fuel rods. They were emitting gamma rays that could kill anyone who stood too close to them for too long. The captain of the S-270 made a decision. He would take the crew, but he would torpedo the K-19. He wanted to sink the cursed boat right there. But Zateyev refused. He stayed on board until the very last man was off. He wanted to tow the K-19 back. Even in his dying moments, he was thinking of his duty. The journey back to the Soviet Union was a funeral procession. The surviving crew of the K-19 crowded into the S-270. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. Within days, Boris Korchilov died. Then the others of the welding team. Their deaths were excruciating. The radiation had destroyed their bone marrow, their digestive tracts, and their central nervous systems. They died screaming in delirium, their bodies falling apart. When they reached the port, the secrecy machine of the Soviet Union kicked into high gear. There were no bands playing. There were no heroes' welcomes. The K-19 was towed to a quarantined dock. The survivors were whisked away to secret hospitals in Moscow and Leningrad. They were forbidden from telling their families what had happened. The doctors were ordered to falsify the death certificates. Radiation poisoning was not an acceptable cause of death in the workers' paradise. They listed the causes as heart failure or pneumonia. The bodies of the dead, the heroes who had saved the world from a nuclear accident, were treated like toxic waste. They were buried in lead coffins soldered shut. They were buried in secret graves in Moscow, with no names on the headstones, only numbers. The families were not allowed to view the bodies. The Soviet state was ashamed of the K-19. They wanted to erase it. They wanted to pretend that the accident never happened, that Soviet technology was flawless. But the K-19 refused to die. The hull was still intact. The radiation levels inside dropped over time. And in a decision that defines the callousness of the Cold War, the Soviet Navy decided not to scrap the boat. It was too expensive to build a new one, so they washed it down. They replaced the reactor compartment. They put a fresh coat of paint on the hull, and they sent it back out to sea. The ship that had killed its crew, the ship that glowed in the dark, was redeployed. The sailors called it the Widowmaker. And the curse was far from over. The K-19 would sail again, and it would kill again. The spirits of the men who died in the blue light of the reactor room were still trapped inside the steel, sailing endlessly beneath the waves, a silent testament to a system that built machines to destroy the enemy, but ended up destroying its own sons. The K-19 returned to the Soviet Union not as a hero, but as a pariah. When the S-270 towed the radioactive hulk into the secret naval base at Polyarny, the reception was chilling. There were no crowds, no flowers, no medals. The pier was cordoned off by KGB troops. Men in full hazmat suits waited to receive the dying. The survivors, the men who had literally saved the world from a thermonuclear explosion, were treated not like saviors, but like contaminated evidence of a crime. They were whisked away to the Institute of Biophysics in Moscow, a secret hospital ward designated number 6. It was a place where people went in but rarely came out. The Soviet state machinery immediately went to work to erase the incident. The Cold War was a war of image, and a nuclear accident of this magnitude was a propaganda disaster that the Kremlin could not afford. The doctors were given strict orders. The words radiation sickness were forbidden. The death certificates of Boris Korchilov and the welding team listed their causes of death as heart failure or vegetative dystonia. It was a final cruel lie. As the sailors lay in their hospital beds, their skin peeling off their organs, failing, the state denied them even the dignity of the truth. They were dying for a country that wouldn't admit what killed them. The funerals were conducted in secret. The bodies were so radioactive that they were deemed a public health hazard. They were placed in wooden coffins, which were then placed inside heavy lead caskets soldered shut to keep the gamma rays from escaping. They were buried in the Kuzminskoye Cemetery in Moscow in unmarked graves. No family members were allowed to attend. No speeches were made. The ground was flattened, and for decades only a few silent, weeping widows knew where the heroes of the North Atlantic lay. But the story of K-19 did not end in that graveyard. The submarine itself, the metal beast, refused to die. The logical decision would have been to scuttle it, to sink it deep in the ocean, where its poisoned hull could hurt no one. But the Soviet Navy was driven by pride and quotas. The K-19 was the flagship. Scrapping it would mean admitting failure. It would mean admitting that the Americans were winning. So in a decision that defies all logic and humanity, the order came down, repair it. The K-19 was towed to the shipyard. The entire reactor compartment, glowing with death, was cut out of the hull and dumped into the Kara Sea, an environmental crime that still haunts the Arctic today. A new reactor section was installed. The hull was scrubbed. The interior was repainted. By 1963, the Widowmaker was back in service. The sailors were terrified of it. They called it Hiroshima. They believed the ship had a soul, and that soul was evil, and history would prove them right. The curse of the K-19 was far from over. In November 1969, the K-19 was prowling the Barents Sea. It was hunting. But it was also being hunted. The USS Gato, an American Thresher-class attack submarine, was trailing it. This encounter highlighted the stark difference in technology between the two superpowers. The American sub was quiet. Its sonar advanced its crew listening to every turn of the Soviet propeller. The K-19, despite its repairs, was still deaf and blind compared to its rival. In a maneuver that remains controversial, the K-19 executed a sudden depth change and turned perhaps a crazy Ivan, perhaps an accident. It slammed violently into the USS Gato. The collision was massive. The bow of the K-19 smashed into the sail of the American sub. On the Gato, the impact was terrifying, but the American hull held. The U.S. crew prepared for combat, fearing the Soviets were ramming them as a prelude to a torpedo launch. The weapons officer on the Gato actually had his finger on the trigger, ready to fire a nuclear torpedo to destroy the K-19. Only the restraint of the American captain prevented World War III for the second time. The K-19, heavily damaged, limped back to port. Once again, it had almost ended the world. Once again, it was repaired. But the Widowmaker was not done killing. On February 24, 1972, the K-19 was on patrol 800 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. A hydraulic line burst in the steering room. The hydraulic fluid, hot and pressurized, sprayed onto a hot filter and ignited. A fire broke out. In a submarine, fire is the ultimate enemy. It consumes the oxygen. It fills the enclosed space with toxic smoke. The fire suppression system failed. The flames spread to the 8th and 9th compartments. Captain Kulababa, now in command, had to make a heartbreaking decision. To save the rest of the ship and the reactor, he ordered the bulkheads sealed. He locked 12 men inside the burning compartment 10. He trapped them to die so that the ship might live. It was the brutal arithmetic of Soviet survival. For the next 40 days, a rescue operation played out in the middle of the Atlantic. The K-19 surfaced rolling in a severe storm. Soviet rescue tugs tried to attach lines, but the waves were too high. Inside the aft compartments behind the fire, 12 more men were trapped. They were in total darkness. The air was foul. They had no food, only salty water from the condensation on the hull. For more than 3 weeks, those 12 men survived in the pitch black, listening to the ocean pound against the hull, wondering if they had been abandoned. It was a testament to human endurance, but it was also a damning indictment of Soviet damage control systems. While American submarines had emergency breathing masks plugged into a central air bank, EABs, and rigorous firefighting protocols born from their own tragedy with the USS Thresher, the Soviet crew was fighting with primitive gear. By the time the K-19 was finally towed back to Russia, were dead. 28 more lives claimed by the cursed boat. And yet, incredibly, the Soviet Navy repaired it again. The K-19 served until 1990. It became the longest-serving nuclear submarine in the Soviet fleet, a zombie ship held together by patches and the blood of its crew. But its final demise came not from an enemy torpedo, but from the collapse of the empire that built it. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the truth finally began to leak out. The policy of glasnost openness allowed the survivors to speak. In 1991, Captain Nikolai Zateyev, now an old man haunted by the memories of 1961, finally told his story to the world. He revealed the lack of cooling systems. He revealed the lead coffins. He revealed the heroism of Boris Korchulov and the welders. The world was shocked. For 30 years, the Soviet Union had hidden a nuclear accident that rivaled Chernobyl. They had let the widows believe their husbands died of pneumonia. The revelation was a final crushing blow to the reputation of the Soviet military. It exposed a system that viewed its soldiers as raw material, expendable, and cheap. Comparing the K-19 to its American counterparts reveals the fundamental difference in philosophy that decided the Cold War. The U.S. Navy had its tragedies. The USS Thresher and USS Scorpion were lost with all hands. But the American response was to invent the SUBSAFE program. They rigorously redesigned every pipe, every valve, every weld to ensure it never happened again. They prioritized safety because a dead crew cannot fight. The Soviet response to K-19 was to cover it up and send the same flawed ship back to sea. They prioritized saving face over saving lives. In 2006, Mikhail Gorbachev, the former leader of the Soviet Union, nominated the crew of the K-19 for the Nobel Peace Prize. He argued that by sacrificing their lives to prevent a thermal explosion that could have been mistaken for a nuclear attack, they had saved the world from a nuclear holocaust. They didn't win the prize, but the nomination itself was a vindication. It transformed them from forgotten victims into recognized martyrs. The end of the K-19 was ignoble but fitting. In 2003, it was towed to the Nerpa shipyard to be scrapped. There were attempts by former crew members to buy the conning tower and turn it into a monument, but the Russian bureaucracy was indifferent. The Widowmaker was cut up into razor blades. The reactor compartment, the scene of such horror and heroism, was stored in a concrete sarcophagus on the Kola Peninsula. The physical curse was gone, but the legacy of the K-19 remains. It serves as a dark monument to the Cold War. It reminds us that the arms race was not just a contest of technology, but a contest of morality. The Americans built machines to protect their men. The Soviets used men to protect their machines. Today, if you visit the Kuzminskoye Cemetery in Moscow, you will find a monument. It was not built by the government. It was paid for by the survivors. It features the silhouette of a submarine and the faces of the men who died in the blue light of the reactor room. They are no longer secrets. They are the silent guardians who walked into the fire so that the rest of us could live. The K-19 is gone, but the question it poses remains: what is the price of superpower status for the Soviet Union? The price was the soul of a nation and the lives of the boys in the lead coffins. The story of K-19 was hidden for 30 years. At Cold War Confidential, our mission is to ensure these stories are never forgotten. If you believe history deserves to be told without censorship, please subscribe and join us for the next deep dive.